This is our last in the 6-session series on understanding the Bible using the historical critical method. Just to review, our first one was about the canons or lists of the books in the Bible, both Protestant and Catholic. The second was on the apocryphal works. We're using that in the sense of the Catholic, not in the sense of the Protestant meaning of that word. The apocryphal Gospels and so forth that are found, and also in the Jewish writings, we have a lot of them. The third session was on how the person who interprets the Bible literally, how does he fare, or that person fare, against scholarship in the historical critical method. Our session number 4, was developed or talked about the Abrahamic and Mosaic stories. Our last session, we got to talking about the historical writings, at least they're purported to be historical, and some of the didactic or teaching, the wisdom literature writings, such as Ruth, Esther. Some of those didn't make it into the Protestant canon. Judith, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the book of Job. Today we're going to finish up with a look at the Gospels, and particularly the writings that contain numbers. There's a lot of symbolism, particularly in the book of Revelation. So we're going to begin with a look at the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, the genealogies, there are two. One is found in Matthew and the other one is in Luke. These two listings are different. They attempt to show that Jesus was a descendant of David. There are some that would look at it and say, well, they're different. Luke, for example, might say that gives one form that would be traceable back through Mary, and the other one would say that some would say that the Matthew version of the ancestry genealogy goes back through Joseph. Historical critical scholars dismiss both of those series, or theories rather. They've looked at the Gospel, for example, of Matthew, the genealogy there, and this genealogy has 3 parts, and with each section supposed to have 14 generations listed. So right there you can see kind of a construct, kind of an artificial putting together of names and ancestors. As regards the list in Luke, unlike that in Matthew, which occurs at the Gospel's outset, we find Luke's genealogy, interestingly enough, after the infancy narrative, so it occurs later. These two lists are identical between Abraham and David, but they differ dramatically from that point onward. Now, these discrepancies between the two lists are obvious, and some have suggested the lists are fabrications, and I think that we have to kind of give some credence to that as a historical critical person. While we're talking about the lists, I mean, you can write them down, you can compare them, and you can see the differences we have. Normally, we would have a descendant coming from the male line, from the male heir, and we have women involved in there. We have names of people rather that were not known. So where did these come from? Were these just made up? What was the situation in the Gospels there? So also we have another issue that the historical critical scholar would look at. How many descendants of David were there? You remember the story of the infancy narrative of Mary and Joseph being asked to go to the home of their ancestor, David. and that turned out to be Bethlehem. Now, how many descendants were there of David at the time of Christ's birth? It's not unreasonable to assume that in 1,000 years from David to the time of Joseph and Mary, that there would have been thousands, and some people have even suggested there might have been 1 million descendants. And when you think about all of the people that would have come from the original David or Davidic line, those descendants crowding in on a tiny little hamlet village, it's no wonder there was no room for them in the inn. So we have to take a look at that decree and the fact that that the gospel quotes that they went back to their home of birth. Well, if everybody did that, there wouldn't have been any room for anybody. No room for in the inn would have been an understatement. I also wanted to point out, while we're on the subject of going back in generations, how many people do we really know in our ancestral line? We can probably trace them 4 or 5 generations back. I went to Germany to try to find where my great-great-grandfather lived, and come to find out his birth records or baptismal record was destroyed in a war, in World War II. Now, I knew what my dad said about my grandfather. I actually spent some time with my grandfather when I was a child, and he would have told me some of the things that he remembered from his father, but he didn't. We went hunting. That was about the extent of it, and picked cherries. That was about the extent of it. So some of the stories that we have from even our own parents, trying to trace back, much less go back the generations that existed between Abraham and Christ, is extremely difficult. That would be extremely difficult. Let's look at the Gospels now. There's an interesting book that was written by Burton Throckmorton, Jr. It's called Gospel Parallels, a comparison of the Synoptic Gospels. And if you ever have a chance to get it, it's a really good one, because it takes the Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, and it shows where there's similarities in the text between the Synoptic Gospels and where they are and how they are put in the laying out of the texts. We're talking about synoptic. I better explain that. Synoptic really refers to 3 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Greek word for synoptic, or the origins of that word, come from syn, S-Y-N, or S, sigma, upsilon, now, which means together, and opsis, omicron, P, sigma, iota, sigma, which means seeing. So take synoptic, and it means seeing with the same eye. So that these 3 Gospels, it was even noted by Augustine that there's some similarities in the way in which the Gospels are presented. Augustine presented an hypothesis. It's been dismissed today. But if you look at the structure of the listing of the Gospels, Matthew gets the first place. And usually when you group these things, you see that the more important one, book of collection of books, gets prior place. Doesn't mean it was the first one written. We see that in the books of the prophets. Isaiah gets number 1 spot. It's the largest book. We see that also in the Gospels. Then we have John's Gospel. John's Gospel is on a kind of a different plane, a lot more theological. There's things in the Gospel of John that seem to contradict some of the things, at least historically, that are found in the other Gospels. Well, if we take, for example, the consensus of scholarship that, at least one view, that Jesus died in 30 A.D., the first Gospel that had been written was the one of Mark, and there's the shortest one. And then there's, after that of Matthew. The first one, Mark, was written around 60 A.D., and Matthew and Luke, written in the 80s, and that of John, certainly later than all of the other 3, in the 90s or even later. Luke, in his first chapter of his gospel, points out that there were plenty of records out there. There were plenty of people that had written something down, and he was going to take a look at them, and he was going to do the best he could to filter out all of what he thought was nonsense, or at least apocryphal, and put down what he thought was the correct gospel. So that there were other accounts, there's this hypothesis that there was an unknown source, or that it existed. We don't have any example of it, called the Q or the Kel, that some of the material in the Gospels of the Synoptics was drawn from. That's out there also as a theory. And there's some reason for that. So we have Mark as the first of the Gospels. Matthew, if you take a look at Matthew, it was traditionally thought that Matthew, who was one of the apostles, that he wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If he had to borrow from Mark, which he does, for his information, and he was an eyewitness as an apostle himself, it seems strange that he would have to rely on another source, a prior gospel. So there's question of whether Matthew wrote his own gospel, and so that's an interesting question. Luke seems to borrow from both Mark and Matthew, and we start to look at this as the synoptic problem. Who came first? Who borrowed from what gospel? At least we know the chronology of the Gospels. As we said, Mark was first, Matthew second, Luke third, and finally John. Taking a look at John's Gospel, that's, as we said, a very different Gospel. It has really the only real proof, at least scripturally, that Jesus is God. It starts out with a bang. It starts out with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Logos was God. In other words, Christ being the Word and the spoken Word of the Father was God himself. So, and in several places in John's Gospel, we can see that the word for Yahweh, I am who am, is used by Jesus. Before Abraham came to be was a quote. Before Abraham came to be, I am. So Jesus uses that several places in the Gospel of John. So John's, one of his functions, it seems to me, was to show that Christ was divine. Now, whether John was the apostle, it seems to be that he was, because it seems that he identifies himself as a person who was at the cross of Christ, and that he was the closer friend of Jesus. So, yet when we look further into the other writings that are, quote, supposedly written by John, unquote, they are finding that the writing styles differ, and especially when we get the book of Revelation, we have an issue there, because that is the writing style is different, and so we may have actually three Johns that wrote the Johannine literature. That would be John, the Gospel, the two epistles of John, and then finally the epistles of John and the book of Revelation. So we have this. When we're talking about the book of Revelation, I'm going to move into the book of Revelation in terms of some of the numeric, the use of numbers. We find in the New Testament and in the Old Testament as well, numbers. We find the number 7. It seems to be most popularly used. In the Bible, it's used over 400 times, so there's some interest in what does it mean. The number 3 is used nearly 500 times, so there's an example of what does it mean. Does it mean literally 3, or does it mean something more? The number 2 was used 800 times, the number 1 over 3,000 times. Anyway, we're going to focus a little bit on 7 because it's one of the more controversial numbers. We have in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the question by Peter, how often should I forgive my brother. And Jesus says, or he asks 7 times, and Jesus says, not 7 times, but 77 times. In other words, Jesus is telling Peter, you forgive him as often as he offends you. Now, the term in that case means repeatedly. It is also used in the story of the 7 loaves of bread and the fish that were given or fed by Jesus to the crowd. The fact that there were 7 baskets left over, another example of 7 being used as something other maybe than the literal interpretation of that, could mean other things. So generally we have 7 meaning a complete series. We have the story of creation as 6 days of work that God created the earth, and then on the 7th he rested. So 7 had, we have the 7-day week and so forth. The book of Revelation has a lot of 7s. The book is addressed to 7 churches by the author. And we have also the 7 spirits before the throne. We have 7 gold lampstands. We have 7 stars, 7 flaming torches, 7 seals, 7 horns, 7 eyes, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, 7,000 people killed in an earthquake, a dragon with 7 heads, with 7 diadems, 7 last plagues, 7 gold bowls, 7 hills, 7 kings. So we're going to wonder what in the heck is going on here with all these 7s. So the consensus of what that means is it's a complete unit. Complete. So it's it might be imperfect, but it's 7 nevertheless is a sense of complete. There's another interesting number in Revelation. There's a quote in there about 144,000 people would be saved, or that would be in heaven with God. And there's a religion that believes that there's only going to be 144,000 who are going to be with Jesus in heaven above this earth. The rest of the people are going to be on earth in their heaven. Well, what is this 144,000 made up of? It's made up of 2 12s and 1,000. It's 12 times 12. We have the 12 tribes. We have the 12 apostles, although there may have been up to 15, but 12 are mentioned, and if you look and try to count all them in the different Gospels, you come up with 15 names, some of which may be synonymous with others. But anyway, 12 squared, again, the technique used there, basically a perfect number of the people of God multiplied by itself. And then you multiply all of that by 1,000. 1,000 had a meaning of an infinite number. So what some literalists would say and fundamentalists would say, oh my, only 144,000 going to get to heaven. That's pretty, not very many. What it's really saying symbolically and in terms of how many people are going to be going to heaven, it's going to be an uncountable number is really what it means there. We could look at some of the contradictions. For example, the gospel story gets at least 5 renditions, all different. And, you start looking at 2 angels here, 1 angel there, and you have to look at each one of the descriptions in the scriptures of the resurrection account. You'd think they'd have got that one right. But there were traditions. There were groups of people that lived. Remember that before these even Gospels were even written down, Mark's first Gospel, that there was an oral tradition. There were groups of people that lived there and had witnessed what had happened. They had seen Jesus, and they remembered things, and they established communities, and some of the stories may even contradict another. It doesn't mean that they're not inspired. No, it's just the way in which translations of what they saw came down in oral writing. I remember we had an accident out here not many years ago, and somebody was killed near my house here. And I thought, when I heard the bang, that a tree had fallen, and yet it turns out that it was a tree hitting a car, but not the way I thought of it as. I tried to remember back what happened And the police report, after I went up and I gave my information, police report simply said that the tree had fallen, crossed the road, a guy was driving, and he hit the tree, and he was killed. To me, there was one bang, and that was, to me, a synonymous bang of not the tree falling, because I was awake and I heard everything. I didn't hear two bangs, I heard one bang. And so the story that officially went down was not in agreement with what I had heard. So, even in stories that we pass along to each other, you can start with one story and it gets to be another story and another story, and somebody adds something and somebody subtracts something, and by the time you're done you get some contradictions. So, is that saying that Scripture is not divinely inspired and that the resurrection accounts were all different and so on? For example, in one gospel there's two feedings of the 5,000 and the 4,000. Some have suggested, the historical critical scholars suggested, that there was only one feeding of the miraculous feeding. I kind of look at that and say, well, if it's in the same gospel, it might have been two events. Also, there's another incident where Jesus goes to the temple and casts out the money changers. John has this happening right in the beginning of his gospel. At the other gospels, it happens at the end of toward the crucifixion. Could there have been two appearances where he cast out the money changers? Again, that's a question for the historical critical scholar to say, well, or maybe just one. On the other hand, there could have been both, and John might have been accurate there. So, I leave you with what should we do in terms of being a faithful Christian? Should we doubt the Scriptures? No, I think we have to admit that they're divinely inspired. Should we look upon all of this as literal material? No. Should we look upon all of this as historical in the sense that the history is inerrant? No. Should we look at all the stories in the Old Testament as true or as having happened? No. A lot of them were parables. A lot of them had purposes for being written, and we have to go back to the mind of the author and say, what did you have in mind? We can't do that, so we have to make the best guess. We also have to look at form criticism. We have to look at how the style of the writing. I don't write any different than I did 5 years ago. I have improved, I think, I hope. But it doesn't mean that if you're using certain words and you're using certain phraseology, and if it shows up differently and you're supposed to be the same author, that you've changed over your lifetime. No. I don't think that's the case. I think that there were many different writers, and I don't know how anybody can look at the Gospels and so forth and say, okay, well, we have a definite chronological line. It doesn't occur that way. They each had a point of view, and they each had a point to make, and they put it together the best they could and in a way they thought was symbolically important. So that concludes our series on the historical critical method. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you've watched all other prior 5 sessions. So thank you.